Millionaire CEO's son was saved by a little girl. His reaction shocked everyone. It was one of those golden spring afternoons when Central Park shimmered with life. The sky stretched wide and blue, and the city seemed to breathe a little easier. Joggers passed with steady strides, earbuds in, sweat glistening. Couples strolled hand in hand near the reservoir, lost in conversation. Vendors called out over the sizzle of carts, selling pretzels, hot dogs, and roasted nuts that filled the air with a warm, comforting scent. Children's laughter echoed as they played tag, tossed frisbees, and blew bubbles that floated like tiny rainbows across the lawn. Tourists took photos near Bow Bridge, while cyclists rang their bells to weave through the crowd. Amid the ordinary magic of the park was Ethan Blake, a name that echoed in boardrooms and financial headlines. Known as the CEO of one of Manhattan's largest tech empires, he was more often seen in Forbes than in family settings. But today, he wasn't a CEO. He was a father, walking quietly beside his 8-year-old son, Lucas, who tugged at his hand every few steps, eyes wide with wonder. Lucas pointed to squirrels, chased butterflies, and paused at every fountain with childish awe. "Dad, look, balloons!" he shouted, running toward a vendor near Bethesda Terrace. Ethan smiled faintly, unfamiliar with the rhythm of fatherhood, but trying to stay present. They passed a street performer playing saxophone, and Lucas twirled to the tune. For a moment, Ethan looked down at his phone. Just one quick glance to check an email, but that second was all it took for everything to fall apart. A red balloon floated upward, drifting toward the trees. Lucas, enchanted, took off after it, his laughter trailing behind him. "Lucas!" Ethan called, startled, but his son was already halfway down the hill. Lucas ran faster, his shoes slipping slightly on the grass. Then, disaster struck. His foot caught the edge of a stone, and he tumbled, straight into the lake near Bethesda Fountain. The splash was loud, sudden, shocking. People turned. A woman screamed. A man ran forward, but stopped short at the edge of the water. "Is someone calling 911?" someone yelled. Lucas surfaced for a moment, coughing, panicking, arms flailing. The world seemed to freeze, except for one person. A small girl sitting beneath a tree nearby, pencil in hand, sketchbook on her lap, saw the entire thing. Her name was Maya Rivera, 9 years old, her ponytail messy, her shirt 2 sizes too big, her sneakers old and scuffed. She had come to the park to draw, as she often did after school, her backpack filled with worn pencils and folded paper. But the moment she saw Lucas struggling, her instincts kicked in. Without a word, she dropped her sketchbook, kicked off her shoes, and ran. The water was cold, and her breath caught as she dove in, but she pushed through, arms slicing forward. Lucas went under again. "Hold on," she cried, pushing herself harder. People watched, stunned, unmoving. Maya reached him, wrapped one arm around his chest, and began to swim back, her small body trembling but determined. A man at the edge crouched and reached out, pulling Lucas from her grasp as she pushed him towards safety. Another hand pulled Maya from the water, her teeth chattering, her lips pale. Lucas coughed again, this time stronger. He was safe. Ethan reached them, breathless, his knees hitting the grass as he grabbed his son, hugging him so tightly it almost hurt. "Lucas, you're okay. You're okay," he whispered over and over, voice shaking. Lucas nodded, still catching his breath, his small hand clutching his father's sleeve. Maya sat nearby, soaked and shivering, hugging herself. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked at Lucas and smiled faintly. She had saved a life, and no one even knew her name. In the middle of New York's most famous park, surrounded by strangers and skyscrapers, a little girl had done what no one else had. She had acted. She had been brave. And though the city kept moving around her, something in that moment had changed forever. Maya sat on the cold edge of the grass, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin as the wind passed gently through the trees. Her sketchbook, which now lay limp beside her, had absorbed enough water to blur the pencil lines she had carefully drawn that morning. She didn't reach for it. Her fingers were trembling, not from fear, but from the chill that seeped into her bones. Around her, people were beginning to scatter, reassured that the danger had passed. Lucas had been saved, and the crisis was over, for them. But Ethan Blake wasn't ready to move on. He crouched beside his son, gripping the boy tightly, as if afraid he might vanish again if he let go. His expensive watch glinted in the sunlight as his arms wrapped protectively around Lucas's small frame. The boy was breathing hard, but no longer coughing, his chest rising and falling quickly under his soaked shirt. A few feet away, a woman's voice rang out, high and surprised. That little girl saved him. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly, following the direction of the voice. And there she was, small, quiet, unnoticed until now. Maya didn't flinch when his gaze met hers. Her lips were slightly parted, her eyes wide and alert, but she didn't appear afraid, only tired, only cold. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks, and a thin trickle of blood ran down her shin from a fresh scratch. Her knees were scraped, her elbows red, but she wasn't crying, not a sound. Ethan stood, gently placed his hand on Lucas's back, and took a slow step toward her. For a man used to commanding stages and boardrooms, he suddenly felt unsure of his footing. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She looked up at him, brushing wet strands of hair behind her ear. "Maya," she said. Her voice was low, steady, no trace of panic, no desperation for attention. "Where are your parents?" he asked, glancing around the area, expecting someone to come rushing over. But no one did. Maya shrugged. "My mom's working. She works nights at the diner on 82nd. I come here after school." Her hand reached slowly for her sketchbook, cradling it gently, like something precious. Ethan studied her. Her clothes were old, faded jeans with torn knees, a shirt that looked like it belonged to someone bigger, maybe passed down. Her backpack had a broken zipper, and her shoes, now lying near the lake, were clearly worn thin. But her eyes, they were sharp, observant, brave. "You saved him," Ethan said, not sure what else to offer. "He looked scared," Maya answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just helped." She didn't stand, didn't puff out her chest, didn't ask if the boy was okay. She already knew he was. Her concern was never about credit. She had done what no adult nearby had the courage to do, yet she sat silently, expecting nothing. A small crowd had formed, murmuring among themselves, pointing occasionally in her direction. Someone handed Maya a towel. She nodded her thanks, wrapped it around her shoulders, and returned to silence. Ethan crouched beside her, less as a CEO and more as a man trying to understand a moment that had shaken him to his core. "That was very brave," he said. Maya gave a small smile, but shook her head. It was just something that needed to be done. She glanced over at Lucas, who now sat drinking water from a bottle someone had handed him. "I didn't want him to drown." There was something deeply matter-of-fact in her tone. No dramatics, no pride. Ethan didn't know what to say. He felt the weight of the moment pressing in on him, not just as a father, but as someone whose life had revolved around logic, data, and results. Maya didn't fit into any of those columns. She wasn't predictable. She wasn't easy to categorize, but she was unforgettable. A police officer finally arrived, speaking with witnesses, taking down quick statements. When they asked Maya her full name, she answered calmly, Maya Rivera. No hesitation, no fear. Ethan stayed close by, watching. He couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about the girl, sitting there drenched and scraped yet composed, stirred something foreign in him. Something warm and aching all at once. Maya glanced back at her sketchbook, then at the pond. The wind ruffled the edges of the towel draped over her shoulders. Her drawing was gone now, the water having smeared the page into grey streaks. But she didn't seem upset. She simply accepted it. Like so much else in her life, it seemed, things were often taken by surprise, yet she endured, quietly, completely unnoticed. Until today, Ethan sat by his office window the next morning, staring at the skyline of Manhattan with eyes that didn't seem to see. The view from the 47th floor had always given him a sense of power, of clarity, but today it only reminded him how far above everything he'd always stood, detached, untouched. The memory of the little girl by the pond kept returning, uninvited and vivid. Maya Rivera. The name echoed in his thoughts like a question he didn't know how to answer. He found himself replaying her calmness, her quiet strength, her refusal to ask for anything. She had vanished into the crowd after the ambulance confirmed Lucas was fine, slipping away like a ghost, unnoticed once again. But Ethan hadn't forgotten. He didn't want to. That afternoon, he turned to Ava, his longtime assistant, and said, I need to find her. Discreetly. Ava, always efficient, didn't ask why. She made calls, sifted through records, and by evening, she had the address. She lives in the Bronx, she said, handing him the file. 1-bedroom walk-up. No father listed. Mother works nights at a 24-hour diner near Fordham Road. Ethan took the file with a strange hesitation. His hands, usually so steady during presentations or mergers, felt awkward, flipping through the pages. The apartment building was old, worn down by time and weather. The photographs showed cracked sidewalks, rusting fire escapes, and a faded green awning that hung crooked over the front door. The apartment number was 4B. Rent was overdue by 2 months. Utilities barely covered. Maya's school records were decent. No honors, but never a complaint. Regular attendance, no disciplinary notes. A quiet student. Doesn't cause problems, one teacher had scribbled in the margin. Ethan sat in silence as Ava left the room. His mind wandered to the drawing Maya had tried to save, now ruined by water. She had brought beauty with her, even if no one had noticed. She created it in a world where survival came first. Her only escape was sketching in a city that often overlooked people like her. And yet, when the moment came, she didn't hesitate to risk everything for someone she didn't even know. No cameras, no crowd, just courage. He thought of the contrast. Lucas safe in a penthouse, private tutors, elite schools, bodyguards on standby, and Maya walking alone every day to a public park with a broken backpack full of pencils, quietly shaping her own world. Ethan had built companies from scratch, sat across from investors with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, negotiated deals worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. But none of it prepared him for the feeling growing in his chest, a mix of guilt, awe, and something unfamiliar. Something like admiration. It unsettled him. Billionaire boardrooms didn't teach you how to understand people like Maya. They taught you how to move numbers, not hearts. He leaned back in his leather chair, the hum of the city far below muffled by the thick glass. The thought came quietly, almost like a whisper he didn't want to admit. How could a girl, who had so little, give something so profound? She had risked herself, not for recognition, not for reward, but because someone needed help. And Ethan, for the first time in years, realized he didn't know what to do. He wasn't used to not having a plan, but he knew one thing with certainty. He couldn't ignore her. Maya had changed something in him. Subtly, irreversibly, she had acted out of instinct, out of goodness, while he, a man with more than most, had frozen. He turned again to her address on the paper. The Bronx felt a world away from his world of glass towers and black cars, but somehow it now felt closer than anything else in his life. He folded the paper slowly and placed it into his wallet. This wasn't about charity. This wasn't about a headline. It was about a little girl who had reminded him that sometimes the richest souls are the ones who live with the least and give without hesitation. Ethan Blake, a man who always knew the value of things, was beginning to understand something deeper. The worth of a person like Maya couldn't be measured in dollars, and for once, he felt poor in comparison. Saturday came with a soft drizzle, the kind that painted the sidewalks in a shimmer and soaked the city in a quiet stillness. The Bronx neighborhood that held Maya's building was waking slowly. Storefront gates creaked open, bodegas swept out the night's dust, and buses sighed at every stop. A black SUV pulled up to the curb in front of the aging apartment complex. It looked out of place among the cracked pavement and rust-stained brick, but the man who stepped out didn't seem to care. Ethan Blake, no suit, no entourage, just jeans, a plain jacket, and something in his expression that wasn't businesslike at all. He held a tablet in one hand and a thick hardcover sketchbook in the other, its pages wrapped in clear plastic to protect them from the rain. A tenant watched him from a window above, eyebrows raised. Others looked up from stoops, curious. But Ethan wasn't here to make an impression. He entered the building, climbed the narrow staircase, and knocked on the door of apartment 4B. It opened cautiously, revealing a woman with tired eyes and a diner apron still tied around her waist. Maya Rivera, Maya's mother, blinked in confusion. "Mr. Blake?" she asked, unsure whether to be alarmed or honored. Ethan smiled gently. "May I come in for a moment?" Inside, the apartment was small, but clean. The wallpaper peeled in some corners, and the light in the kitchen flickered, but it was a home held together by effort and love. Maya sat at the table, pencil in hand, sketching silently. When she looked up and saw him, her eyes widened, not in fear, but in confusion. She hadn't expected to see him again. "Hi, Maya," Ethan said, his tone soft, almost unsure. She gave a small nod, watching him closely as he sat across from her. Eleanor remained standing, arms crossed slightly, protective. Ethan rested the sketchbook and tablet on the table, then looked at them both. "I didn't come here to give you charity," he began, careful with every word. "I came here because your daughter reminded me what real strength looks like." He turned to Elena. "You work long hours. You do everything for her. That deserves more than a thank you." He slid a folder from his bag and handed it across the table. Inside was an offer, a full-time job at his company's headquarters in Midtown. Admin assistant, benefits, paid training, a schedule that fit with Maya's school hours. Elena stared at it, her hands frozen. "Why would you do this for us?" she asked. Ethan paused, his gaze dropping to Maya's drawing. "Because people like you shouldn't be invisible. You've done more with less than most people ever do with everything." Then he turned to Maya, and from his bag, he pulled out the sketchbook, a new one, leather-bound, thick pages, crisp and clean. Alongside it, an envelope containing a full scholarship to a private art academy in Manhattan, transportation, supplies, even a tailored winter coat, waiting at the school's welcome office. Maya's eyes flickered with disbelief. "But why?" she asked. "I didn't save him for stuff." Her voice was steady, honest. There was no excitement in her words, just truth. She meant it. Ethan nodded slowly. "I know," he said, his voice low. "That's why you deserve it." Maya looked at the envelope, then at her mother, then at the man who sat in their small kitchen like he belonged there, not as a billionaire, but as someone trying to do the right thing. Elena reached out and gently touched Maya's back, silently urging her to accept. Maya's fingers hovered over the sketchbook. It was heavier than any she'd ever owned, the paper thick enough to hold paint, ink, anything she imagined. "You don't owe me anything," she said. Ethan smiled. "You're right, but sometimes doing the right thing means showing up when someone like you shows the rest of us how to be better." The room was quiet for a long moment. The rain tapped gently at the windows. Then Maya whispered, "Okay," as she cradled the sketchbook in her arms like something fragile and priceless. Ethan didn't stay long. He didn't pose for a picture. He didn't make a speech. He simply stood, nodded respectfully to Elena, and said, "Welcome to something new." As he stepped out into the misty street, he felt lighter than he had in years, not because he'd given, but because for the first time, it felt like he'd received something far greater. The rain had stopped by the time Ethan's SUV pulled away from Maya's block, but the sky still held onto a heavy grayness that matched the quiet stirring inside him. Back in his office the next day, something felt different. The view of Manhattan's steel and glass no longer inspired pride, only distance. He sat at his desk, staring at the calendar on his screen, jam-packed with meetings, investor calls, and product pitches, and for the first time, he clicked decline on 3 back-to-back appointments. No explanation, no guilt. He shut his laptop, stood up, and left early. That evening, he picked Lucas up from school himself. No driver, no assistant. Just him, leaning awkwardly against a brick wall outside the schoolyard, clutching a juice box and a paper bag of snacks like he was still learning how to be a dad. Lucas looked surprised, then smiled, genuinely. They walked home together, talked about art, about school, about nothing. It was the first time Ethan had walked at his son's pace in years. In the following weeks, he started carving out time he used to claim he never had. He visited Lucas's classroom for parent presentations. He sat in the front row at his school's spring recital, clapping louder than anyone. He didn't just ask about his day, he listened. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was steady. At work, people noticed changes too. Ethan no longer shut himself in his glass-walled office for hours. He began hosting morning check-ins, not to scold or demand results, but to ask people how they were doing, really doing. A quiet buzz began to spread through the company. Rumors turned into wonder. Was the Iceman melting? The man who once fired an intern for a 5-minute delay now paused meetings to check on employees with newborns. One day, he walked into the boardroom and laid out a proposal no one had seen coming, a non-profit initiative funded entirely by his company's profits. The room fell silent. He called it the Rivera Grant Foundation, a tribute, he said, to a girl who reminded him that courage wasn't about wealth, it was about willingness. The foundation would focus on after-school programs for underserved communities, free art therapy for trauma-exposed youth, and full scholarships for students across New York's 5 boroughs. He assigned an entire team to it. No flashy launch party, no media spin. Just results, grounded, quiet, real. And behind every major decision he made from that point on, people began to see a shift, not in his strategy, but in his soul. He smiled more, listened longer, he remembered birthdays, he held doors. On Father's Day, for the first time, Lucas gave him a card he had drawn himself, not one bought by a nanny. It showed the two of them in Central Park, holding hands beneath a tree. Ethan framed it and placed it right beside the framed Forbes cover that once meant everything to him. Investors still respected him. The company still grew. But now, when people talked about Ethan Blake, it wasn't about his net worth. It was about his impact. Former critics on finance blogs who once called him stone-hearted now praised his unusual shift in leadership. The man once accused of living above the city now moved within it. He stopped using private entrances, took the subway once just to remember how it felt, donated quietly to schools in neighborhoods he'd never stepped foot in before. Sometimes he'd glance down at the folded piece of paper in his wallet, the one with Maya's name and address. It reminded him that the person who taught him the most about life was someone the world almost never saw. Maya didn't ask for any of this. She had returned to her own rhythm: school, sketching, growing. But her impact had bloomed beyond a single act of bravery. She had reshaped a man who thought he had everything. And through her, Ethan learned that being a father wasn't about providing things. It was about showing up, staying present, and being willing to change. The world still called him a CEO. But now, they also called him something more rare: human. Spring returned to New York like a gentle breath, brushing life back into its parks and streets, and with it came quiet symbols of how far things had come. Central Park, now greener than ever, rustled with new leaves and old memories. The same winding path that once led to fear and chaos now carried laughter, footsteps, and something softer: peace. On a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon, the bench near Bethesda Fountain stood out, not for its design or color, but for what had been added to it. A small bronze plaque gleamed under the sun, newly installed and freshly polished. It bore a single inscription, simple and sincere: to Maya Rivera, the heart of New York. It didn't need more. The name said enough to those who knew, and to those who didn't, curiosity would do the rest. Maya sat on that bench now, her once-worn backpack replaced with a neat messenger bag covered in pins from her new art school. Her shoes were new, but muddy from a morning walk. Her sketchbook rested on her lap, open to a half-finished drawing of the Bethesda Fountain, shaded with skill, far beyond her years. Beside her, Lucas leaned over, pointing at a figure she'd drawn. "That one looks like Dad," he laughed. "Too serious?" Maya giggled and added oversized glasses to the sketch. Not far from them, Elena sat on the grass, sharing lunch with Ethan, both watching their children with an ease that could only come from healing. Elena's laughter was louder now, her shoulders no longer weighed down by exhaustion or worry. Her uniform had been traded for a soft cardigan and a weekend smile. Ethan sat cross-legged beside her, his phone forgotten in his pocket, a bottle of juice in one hand and a granola bar in the other, Lucas's favorite. His eyes didn't look over reports anymore when he was here. They followed the kids instead, not to protect, but to admire. Nearby, tourists wandered past, snapping photos of the lake, the bridge, the skyline, but a few paused to read the plaque. Some smiled, some blinked, as if touched by the simplicity of it. A few even asked aloud, "Who's Maya Rivera?" And sometimes, passers-by would hear an answer from those who knew. "She's the reason this bench means something." A soft breeze carried the scent of street pretzels and grass. A violinist played near the fountain, his bow dancing over strings like birds over water. Maya glanced up from her sketch and let her eyes drift across the scene. Couples strolling, kids tossing bread to ducks, a dog splashing in the water. She sketched faster now, her hand confident, her heart calm. She no longer sat in silence, no longer hid in corners. She belonged here now, not as a guest, not as a visitor, but as someone whose presence had rippled through lives and left them better. Lucas leaned his head on her shoulder for a moment, quietly content. They weren't siblings, they didn't share blood, but they shared something more powerful, a single moment that changed both of their lives forever. And in the small circle around that moment, a new kind of family had formed, one built not on obligation, but on choice, on gratitude, on love. Ethan watched them from a few feet away, his face soft, unguarded. He reached into his wallet and touched the folded paper that still lived there. Maya's name and address, now no longer needed, but never forgotten. Eleanor reached over and took his hand. No words exchanged, just a shared understanding between two people who had seen the worst and discovered the best. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the grass, Maya stood, stretched, and looked at the plaque. For a second, she just stared at her name, blinking slowly. She didn't cry. She smiled, not because it made her feel important, but because it reminded her she mattered. And in a city of millions, that was everything. People kept walking, music kept playing, life moved on, as it always does in New York. But something quiet lingered in the air, a reminder that in a world driven by noise and numbers, it had taken one small girl, a sketchbook, and a moment of instinct to remind everyone that kindness still exists, even in the shadows of skyscrapers.